Hello, my name is Jim Beichler. I'm going to talk about the physics of consciousness, more particularly the consciousness of unification and the mind-matter fallacy bites the dust. There are two general beliefs that presently render a physical theory of consciousness improbable. Not impossible, but improbable. Consciousness is not material, so it cannot be physical, and classical physics cannot explain consciousness. Both of these are entirely false and grossly misleading. Physical fields, such as gravitational, electrical, and magnetic, are physical, but non-material, and consciousness has the characteristics of a field, which would be physical but non-material. And consciousness also acts at all levels of reality, so it can only be explained by a combined quantum classical field theory. The gravity field of matter is too weak to explain consciousness, and the brain is electrically active, which implies that electromagnetism is involved in mind and consciousness somehow. In fact, most theories are electrical theories of consciousness, but they don't seem to pan out, whether they're quantum or classical. The electrical nature of the brain is tied to individual ion exchange in these electrical theories, which is material. So that only leaves a magnetic field to explain consciousness. Magnetic fields of matter, such as the brain and body, have an additive or collective domain structure, and magnetic fields commonly guide the motion of ions and charged particles. Both of these properties seem to be shared with consciousness, which also has a domain structure, different levels of consciousness, and seems to guide the mind. And mind is associated with motion of ions up in neurons and neural nets. Under these circumstances, we can theorize that a living body is just a complex pattern of energetic particle exchanges, at least that's the way it's viewed by the physicists, as compared to the biochemical processes studied by chemists and biologists. So, life must be an emergent complexity, or a 3D matter-energy field pattern, that can be modeled by quantized space-time curvature. Now that's life, the extra thing of life that goes beyond what the biologists study, the vis viva, the whole life force that's been talked about for hundreds of years. It can't be anything else. Mind then can only be modeled as a multi-level emergent 3D complexity pattern of electric scalar potential, which is superimposed on the matter-energy pattern of living organisms, all living organisms. Therefore, consciousness can only be a multi-level emergent four-dimensional complexity pattern of magnetic vector potential domains that correspond to the electric mind. Now, I'm not talking four-dimensional space-time, I'm talking about four-dimensional space. Life, mind, and consciousness are not the matter, energy, electric, and magnetic fields associated with living organisms. Life, mind, and consciousness are the stable variational pattern complexity of these fields, of the space-time curvature or matter-energy field, the electric scalar and magnetic vector potential fields that correspond to the organism. They're not the fields, they are the patterns in the fields. Life is a physical complexity of different chemical interactions. Mind is a functional complexity of life, of the electric forces that correspond to the living pattern. And consciousness is a memory complexity of magnetic potential within the mind. The commonly held belief that mind and consciousness exist in the brain is also a major fallacy. And by fallacy, I mean a falsehood that has risen to the level of paradigm, or a phallic symbol, in a sense, that no one wishes to break, go against. Everybody follows the same patterns of thought. And that's the fallacy. The complexity patterns correspond to the whole body, but only seem to exist within the brain alone, because awareness of consciousness and mind emerge in the neural nets of the brain. In other words, the brain only seems to house the mind, and consciousness, because of the dense concentration of neurons in the brain, because they take the form of neural nets that are only found in the brain. And the neural nets are basic logic circuits by which we think, and the manner in which they function. They function as logical circuits. We don't have those anywhere else in the body. So where the neurons form neural nets in the brain, awareness of mind and consciousness arrive, but only the awareness, not mind and consciousness themselves. Thus concentrating our primary awareness of consciousness and mind in the brain. So science must look to the neural nets where awareness and different levels of consciousness emerge to determine the physical nature of mind and consciousness. If we look at a simple neuron, we have the axon, the axon terminals and dendrites that go to the sensory organs, the cell body or nucleus, the synapses at the end of the dendrites, and the nucleus in the cell body. Here's a better picture. This one in particular shows the cell body and the end of the axon, but the whole cell, the whole neuron is covered by a membrane, and in that you have a microtubule or a skeletal structure. And so microtubules I want to talk about here because they're an extremely important element in both mind and consciousness. Now signals from the external world that eventually form memories reach the brain as electrical impulses that travel up along the axons called action potentials. An action potential will fire, then slowly drift off, and then you have another action potential. And this is how we sense the external world. Now the neuron then is basically an LRC circuit. That stands for inductance, resistance, capacitance. And that's a very special circuit in physics. The action potential comes up the outside of the axon. It ionizes, ions travel through the cell wall and basically turn the cell wall or the axon wall into a capacitor. But they change the electrical field inside. So as an action potential comes up, the electric field inside also changes, and this causes the microtubules to fire, forming induction, biomagnetic induction coils with one end facing one way. Now the advanced action potential induces the microtubules to charge magnetically in a sequential pattern. The pattern is very important. The tubulin proteins that make up the microtubulin cylinders that form the skeleton have a very specific structure, and they only have two electrical states, alpha and beta. So they'd fire either alpha, 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 or beta, 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 beta. But the way they're constructed, the signal then, alpha, 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 would go spirally around the cylinder. Well, that matches the electron flow, or the electrical current, in the wires that make up an induction coil. And the induction coil is the basic element in all radio transmitters, receivers, or transceivers. So it's a sequential firing order of the tubulin molecule electronic states mimics the electron flow of an electric current in an induction coil, a classical induction coil. And that's the basis of all radio receivers and transmitters. So microtubules basically form nano LRC circuits in conjunction with the cell, the axon walls. This means that every neuron has millions of nano radio transceivers within it whose resonant frequencies only differ according to the length of the microtubules, because all the microtubules are exactly the same in everything except their length. So different lengths would determine different transmission frequencies. The microtubules emit electromagnetic or light pulses, not light waves, but pulses, solitons. So they go ping, 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 ping instead of hum. Now these light pulses can have two functions. They can be absorbed by like-sized microtubules in the same and neighboring neurons and establish a secondary resonance pattern in different microtubules or in different neurons. This would be different thought or more complex memory patterns eventually, as you'll see. Now, different sized microtubules within each neutron also establish extremely complex 3D standing wave patterns in a space occupied by the water medium. In other words, there's water between the microtubules that form the skeleton. Here are two microtubules, there's water between them. Each emit solitons, they cause interference patterns between them. These 3D patterns correspond to memories, and they can quantize the nuclear magnetic spin resonances of the water molecules between the microtubules to establish permanent magnetic vector potential patterns for memory storage, recall, and the recognition. And they store these in the actual points of space. In other words, thoughts are stored magnetically in the points in space between your ears, and actually throughout your body, but they're only reached levels of complexity where we know them, we're aware of them within the brain because of the neural nets. In other words, magnetic vector potential patterns that correspond to unique memories are imprinted directly into discrete points in the 3D space-time continuum. And although they're in the 3D space-time continuum, they are projected along the fourth dimension, whose points form the consciousness pattern. The consciousness pattern is three-dimensional magnetic field B, which corresponds to the mind, but its variations in time extend along the fifth direction of the space-time continuum, or the fourth dimension of space. This structural duality yields all the strange physical characteristics that scientists normally associate with consciousness, such as conscious time, which varies from our normal clock time or universal time. Conscious time is also called a specious moment because conscious time can be longer or shorter depending on many different factors in the mind. New levels of consciousness emerge from the interaction and mixing that occurs between these patterns, these thought patterns, as they are stored at points in the space-time continuum to form higher level complexities of memories and thought. So these different levels of memory and thought, complexity levels, called magnetic domains, are actually levels of consciousness. Microtubules are thus the key components in the emergence of higher levels of mind and consciousness, since they play such an important role as pattern guides in the storage and retrieval of memories as well as recognition. Now, the vast multi-level complexity of memory patterns that emerge from the storage and retrieval of simple memories at the microtubule water molecular level are essential to the evolutionary path that develops higher levels of consciousness in living organisms. All living organisms have consciousness, but as far as we know, humans have the highest level. In other words, they have a more complex domain structure of magnetic fields, thoughts stored, but they'd also have more complex levels, more complexities within each domain itself. Altogether, there are four fundamental magnetic domains or interacting levels that contribute to the awareness of consciousness in the neural nets. You have the water molecules at the lowest level, the neutron brain, and they are the quantized nuclear magnetic resonators that store and retrieve thoughts. Microtubules act as classical magnetic inductors. They establish and guide these processes. Then you have the axon and neural walls, are classical electrical capacitors, and act as current-carrying wires, creating a magnetic field around them. In other words, as the action potential comes up the axon, like a current-carrying wire, you form magnetic fields around the axons and the neurons. So that's a third level from the smallest of the magnetic domains. Then neural nets as a whole, whose connections are guided by electromagnetic resonance between various microtubules, form the logical circuit. So then neural nets would be the fourth domain, magnetic domain, the fourth from the smallest magnetic domain in the different levels that create consciousness. Now here we have a diagram of this. You've got the action potential to and from the external world along the axon. Then the axon, the action potential along the axon causes microtubules to fire. So you get the inter-microtubule soliton interference patterns. When the solitons are emitted, they cause interference patterns to water molecules, and that gives you memories are stored as magnetic vector potential patterns. You get storage and recall and recognition here. But at the microtubule level, you also have solitons emitted to resonate with exterior microtubules, and those set up field lines that actually guide the placement of synapses on other, within other neurons, on other neurons, and that forms a neural net, and that also explains neural net plasticity. Under these conditions, the more comprehensive, larger scale, the next level magnetic resonance pattern that emerges between microtubules and nearby neurons or neighboring neurons also guides the placement of dendrite bulbs to form new synaptic junctions and thus new logic circuits within the neural nets, and this again is called the brain or neural net plasticity. Now suppose you have a thought or an experience that fires 3 microtubules in the primary neuron, but then it matches 3 in the others, so then the dendrite forms a connection there between these 3 and these 3, following the magnetic field lines between the neurons. But suppose you have a new thought or new experience that charges those 3 plus 1 more. It might resonate at a different place in the neuron. So you now have stronger magnetic field lines between the 2 neurons here. So dendrite would actually follow the stronger field lines and detach here and reattach here, and that's your neural plasticity. And neural plasticity comes with new experiences and new learning. Now, since the neural nets rewire themselves or demonstrate plasticity through new learning and new experience, a new form of top-down evolution that conforms to recent scientific observations is strongly implied by this model, because as you get more experiences and learning, you cause more chaos at any given level of complexity. The more chaos from an older domain, the more chaos disrupts that domain and then creates a new complexity, which then leads to new neuroplasticity. And so this is sort of a cascading effect that leads to new evolution. Eventually you have so many complexities changing with new learning and experiences. You have a paradigm shift or worldview shift or gestalt switch in your brain in the way you think because of these, the neuroplasticity that is explained in this way. In other words, and these can affect DNA to affect inheritance or evolution. Now we have 2 types of evolution. We have Darwinian natural selection. You have basic chemical reactions to life and body, mind and brain, and consciousness. Or you have the modern view, which is mutation and genetic drift at the molecular level of DNA. Now in that case, consciousness is an epiphenomenon, just a side product of this process, but not an inherent, it isn't inherently involved in the process of inheritance and evolution. However, a more realistic evolutionary pathway would look like this. You have chemical reactions, which give a chemical complexity. Life emerges in the body, but at the same time, you have a functional complexity, which is electrical in nature, and mind emerges, and a memory complexity then, magnetic, and consciousness emerges. And as each higher level emerges, since their complexities, they organize the next lower level from which they evolved. And this is and all of a sudden consciousness is no longer an epiphenomenon. And all living bodies have a very primitive mind and consciousness, at least. Even going back 300, 400, 500 million years when you had single-celled organisms and only single-celled organisms. It's just they hadn't reached any mind complexities. Those only had basic chemical complexities. They didn't have a functional complexity, a memory complexity to evolve higher forms of animal life. Now this model is actually very important because it explains things that Darwinian and modern evolution theory can't. Primarily the Cambrian explosion. About 200 million years ago, all life was, a little over 200 million years ago, all life was single-celled. And all of a sudden, over a 2 million year period, bicameral or multi-celled organisms, very complex organisms, took over. And you have all types of coral and different organisms forming at this point in time. And that's never been explained before. Darwinian and normal genetic drift cannot explain that very rapid change from unicellular life to multicelled life that's bicameral, split right and left side, where you have a symmetry between right and left side. Well, the symmetry from right and left side indicates that this was a mind-controlled complexity, because mind goes on electrical charges which are positive and negative, 2 sides. And so you have, all of a sudden, mind developed a complexity that reorganized the body to make multi-celled animals. But at that same point, within a short period after that, you also had a bifurcation. You also have splittings when you have the arising complexity. It can split in two different ways. In this case, it's split between functional complexity and a formal or complexity of form. Now, the functional complexity led to later consciousness complexities and the development of the brain and central nervous system, animal life. Although the complexity of form that evolved was plant life, which eventually came to be based on photosynthesis. And it has no brain or central nervous system. Now, this is actually verified by the fact that plants form chaotic, they look like chaotic complexity. You take a Mandelbrot set or some other chaotic complexity in mathematics and actually draw ferns and maple leaves and plants. They take the form of these complexities. So because they're based on a formal complexity or a complexity of form. However, this model of evolution completely disagrees with modern thermodynamics. That's a problem. Thermodynamics is based on disorder and entropy, not complexities. But then there are also fundamental problems with thermodynamics that the physical community ignores. For example, the perceived completeness of modern thermodynamics is a fallacy. Another fallacy, a phallic symbol. This has become a paradigm that's become so large you can't topple it. Modern thermodynamics is based only on disorder and entropy. It cannot explain any order in the universe, and that's from stars to galaxies, all orderly systems, to planets, to living organisms. Can't be explained. Anytime there's order, it can't be explained by thermodynamics. So thermodynamics is incomplete, but it can be expanded very easily. You have a new thermodynamics. You have the original 4 laws of thermodynamics, 0, 1, 2, and 3, but you add a 4th law of thermodynamics, which is based on Prigoghine's principle. This solves a closed system problem because in thermodynamics, you have closed systems which are disorderly with entropy increasing, disorder increasing, but there is no such thing as a closed system in nature. All systems are open, and they already use Prigoghine's principle to modify the 2nd law of thermodynamics and explain thermodynamic systems. So then they already use it, take it, make it the 4th law of thermodynamics. Then you have chaos and the emergence of complexities. This solves the exclusion problem, that certain things like life are excluded. That order is excluded from thermodynamics. And this chaos is just entropy. So entropy, the emergence of complexity, forms. Order comes from disorder. In chaos theory, what's called linear dynamics in physics. So make that the 5th law. But when you take Prigoghine's principle, you get higher and higher levels of complexity, and take the emergency of complexity, you put these together and you get the universal evolution system. And this solves the ubiquity problem. Why we have orderly systems, they're ubiquitous throughout the universe. And probably life is ubiquitous throughout the universe. Although life is the highest complexity, or the most complex form that we know of in the universe. The 7th law would be Murphy's law. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong. And this basically solves a quantum or measurement problem because it throws a little bit of disorder right back in and seems to be probabilistic. So we can throw Murphy's law in there as the 7th law of thermodynamics. Now, in this new thermodynamics, evolution is the real arrow of time. Arrow of time has always been thought to be that entropy increases in the universe in any given open system, and evolution is the arrow of time. But that's not true. Or entropy is not the arrow of time. Evolution is the arrow of time, and entropy, disorder, is merely its shadow. We now have top-down evolution to supplement the normal Darwinian genetic bottom-up evolution. In fact, top-down evolution becomes more dominant the more complex the life form, since bottom-up evolution becomes increasingly more difficult. As you get more and more complex systems, like humans, it's hard for genetic drift in a gene in my tip of my finger to change me, make me evolve. But top-down is easy because top-down controls the whole being, the whole object. So it becomes easier the more complex the system grows. This new form of scientific top-down evolution effectively supersedes non-scientific explanations such as intelligent design, creationism, and God's direct hand in evolution. They're not needed anymore to explain things like the Cambrian explosion, which a lot of people, religious people, try and do. They can now be explained by consciousness. Consciousness evolves, consciousness becomes more complex, too complex, and then it forms a new complexity that rearranges below it. That is intelligent design, but the intelligent is consciousness as it evolves. Given all influencing factors, historical, biological, and cultural, that have occurred in the last century and a half, this new model strongly implies that a new leap in human evolution is rapidly approaching if it has not already begun. The last leap in human evolution occurred, supposedly, as far as we can tell from the archaeological record, when humans became aware themselves. They had increased brain capacity and complexity, which can be interpreted in physics as differentiating between local, body and self, and non-local, the external world, space and time. So when we learn to differentiate between local space and the rest of the universe, self, not self, the external world, and the present moment in time as opposed to past and future, we became localized, physics talk, and we start thinking about self, which is, recognition of self is supposedly the key to human consciousness. Now, this occurred between 40 and 100,000 years ago. We see that in the archaeological record because people started burying their relatives, their loved ones, with objects to carry them into the future. We started having abstract cave art. So this last leap, when we localized, our minds localized in space and time, occurred 40 to 100,000 years ago. But it's only within the second scientific revolution between 1900 and 1927 that we fully exploited the concepts of space-time and locality, non-locality for the first time in human history. We exploited space-time with theory of relativity and non-locality, non-locality with the quantum theory. So this brought the new concepts of space and time to a new level of human understanding. In other words, we've scoped out space-time and locality, non-locality quite a bit now in science. So science is actually following human evolution. That required an even opened human consciousness up to the possibility of something more. Our leap in evolution, our evolutionary leap in consciousness, will coincide with a new paradigm shift in physics, the third scientific revolution. The last revolution merely fulfilled the promise of the last leap. We learned to directly experience space and time in human consciousness. The last leap occurred 40 to 100,000 years ago, but if you look at the total evolution of life, the emergence of mind and consciousness, specific leaps are occurring more often with shorter and shorter periods of time between leaps. If our last leap took place that long ago, we're due for a new leap. And the same is true with scientific revolutions. The first one, 1600, well, technically the 0th one, with Plato and Aristotle, 2,000 years ago. Then in the 17th century, the scientific revolution. The beginning of the last century, the second scientific revolution, shorter and shorter periods between them. So we are due for a new scientific revolution. So the upcoming evolutionary leap will surely coincide with new unification of physics, the third scientific revolution, in which we will begin to learn about and manipulate or directly experience the higher embedding dimension of space. This model also strongly implies that consciousness survives material death of the body, while the five-dimensional space-time continuum, or the single field, Einstein's unified field, the single field structure, all but guarantees the existence of certain paranormal abilities and explains mystical enlightenment, near-death experiences, and other reported anomalous phenomena. It's all the geometry of space-time that explains all these. For example, we have 3D space on on the horizontal axis. The vertical axis is the fourth dimension of space. We have, say, consciousness B pattern and some event. Now they have width. Space is dualistic. You have point space and extension space. Point space, all the points in space come together in a single polar space in the fourth dimension of space. So that's part of the dualism of space. So both the event A, its pattern, and the consciousness pattern are extended. But as they come to, as the points in space come together in point space in a higher dimension, those two events, consciousness and the event, will overlap. When they overlap here, that's the mechanism of psi. We call that psi, and that is the source of all paranormal phenomena. So consciousness, which is four-dimensional, survives the three-dimensional body and mind according to Maxwell's fourth law of electromagnetism. A varying magnetic reaction creates electricity, or the magnetic field change variations create variations in the electric field. We know that to be true. It's the source of electromagnetic theory. So we have, in a sense, a light body in our bodies, but the magnetic part survives and recreates mind. Now, the normal perception pathway during life goes from the external world, 3D space, through the five senses, up the axons to the brain. Then once in the brain, stored electricity, mind, and stored magnetically in 4D consciousness. We also have the paranormal perception pathway during life. You have from 4D space, the fourth dimension of space, to consciousness, mind, and 3D brain. When you die, the brain and body disappear, so then you have perception pathway afterlife. We're actually beings in four-dimensional space. Consciousness becomes our sensory organ, so it goes to magnetic, and then it goes to 3D mind, which is recreated upon death by the 4D consciousness. Now, there's a great deal of circumstantial evidence and experimental data which support this model. But of course, the complete model has not yet been verified, even though this model is completely falsifiable. Thank you.